Hi class, today we're going to look at another question that you guys will have on your upcoming test. I'm going to take this apart in two different sections, although the question will have to be answered as a whole. How did the British attempts to maintain firm control over the American colonies after the French and Indian War and the growing colonial resentment towards the British lead to the Revolution? So we're looking at this in two different parts. This first video is going to be looking at the first part in terms of the British attempts, and then checking on the other video about what the colonies are doing that will add to this resentment. Again, this is not meant to be a how-to type of thing. It's meant to be a review. So whatever I go over in this, if you're not quite sure about all the tiny minor details, you're going to want to look them up. Okay, so a quick review on the French and Indian War. It's also called the 7 Years' War in Europe. So knowing that when we talk about the debt that will incur from this war, it's not just the fighting that takes place in North America, but they have quite a massive war going on in Europe at the same time. So that's why Britain's going to owe a lot of money. Why does it come to North America? Basically, they're fighting over land rights in the Ohio River Valley area. And really, George Washington was there from the get-go, if you remember what we talked about in class. There's also tensions between Native American tribes, tensions between themselves, as well as tensions between what side they're going to be on. Are they going to side with the French, or are they going to side with the British? And so tribes are going to be divided on that. The French posed a relatively smaller threat in terms of the amount of colonization, the amount of respect that the French had been showing to the tribes in comparison to the British numbers in terms of the colonization, the trading rights, as well as the amount of respect. So why exactly do the British need the colonial help? Well, their troops are pretty stretched out. Remember, they are fighting in Europe. And the thought process is if the colonists want to expand, meaning go past the Appalachian Mountains and of course expand the colonization process, then the colonists should be helping us in order to do that. For the colonists, there's huge risks here. Once the men leave their homestead, it's open to invasion from not just the French, but mostly from the Native American tribes that are helping the French. And there's plenty of stories about the women and children that are left behind are going to be killed, and your home is basically destroyed. And of course, the rewards are the further expansion west. And we know the population in the colonies is always expanding. People tend to live longer, healthier lives, and they want that land. So just a little quick review about what areas we're talking about here. Ohio River Valley and throughout here, this is where most of the fighting at least is going to start, but then you're going to see a lot of fighting up on the forts through Canada. So this is the entire territory that we're talking about that could be on the line if the British win. So yay, Britain wins, okay? Then why aren't the colonists happy about this? So before we really get into that question, we need to talk a little bit about the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. And most of this is based on mercantilism. So just a brief review. This is when the mother country is going to establish colonies to act as the producer of raw materials and, of course, make them the consumer of the processed materials that are made in the home country. This is, of course, going to limit the trade of the colonies to the mother country and also limit their manufacturing capabilities. Now, we've talked about this in class lots of different ways. The stress is that the colonies feel like they aren't paid enough in order to buy a lot of the processed materials that are going to be more costly than the raw materials they are sending over, which leads to a lot of smuggling. And the smuggling had been going on for a long time. There are navigation laws on the books, but they are not enforced until after the French and Indian War, and even during the French and Indian War, because the colonists are smuggling still to the French colonies, especially throughout the Caribbean, and the British find this out, and they know that they are losing money on the smuggling, as well as it's somewhat embarrassing to be trading with your enemy. So navigation laws are going to start to be enforced, which means lots of colonists are not going to be happy about this. Also, the important phrase here is salutary neglect. Starting in the late 1690s, but some historians would argue even earlier, is that basically Britain is going to weaken its supervision over the colonies. There wasn't a real firm, I guess, policy in place about what to do with the colonies and how to keep them in line. And as long as they were making money on them, which of course Britain was, even though with the smuggling going on, they just kind of turned, kind of a blind eye to what the colonists were getting away with. And in the scheme of things, the colonists were growing up, so they were pretty happy with the fact that they had this quasi-independence, at least a little bit, and then that starts to change after the French and Indian War. So prior to the French and Indian War, for the most part, Britain is not going to enforce navigation acts. Colonies are allowed to govern themselves with some local control in terms of what's taking place within the colony. We've talked about how colonists sometimes will have the ability, at least the male colonists who are voting, to choose their governor. We know that the colonies had the power to pay the governors, even if the governor was appointed by the king. So there is a lot of somewhat, I guess you'd say, quasi-autonomy taking place here, and that's going to start to move away. There is a limited amount of taxes. We've talked about this before, is that people in Britain are paying far more taxes than their peers in the colonies. Then you get the Proclamation of 1763. Now remember, one of the promises that Britain is going to make to the colonists in order to get them to fight is that if we win, we're going to let you expand past those Appalachian Mountains and have bigger homesteads, and people are willing to risk their lives in order to do this. So once, of course, Britain wins, people start to expand further west. The Native Americans are not really pleased about that. You've got you have the Pontiac's Rebellion, and you've got all these people that are being killed throughout the frontier. The British troops can't really protect them. They are too spread out. And so the British king is going to say, nope, no more movement behind those Appalachian Mountains until we get a firmer policy set up and how to handle the Native Americans. So that's the Proclamation of 1763. And as most colonists are not happy with this, they are going to defy this proclamation line, and they will continue moving west. You also have the Navigation Acts, which I've talked about. They are going to start to be enforced. And that also means that there will be a standing army that will be left in the colonies as well. And not that there probably wasn't troops there to begin with, but the numbers are going to seem a little more, probably bigger in some areas than others, as well as the fact that now the colonists say, well, we no longer have a threat by the French, so why do we need an army here? Colonists are going to start to get a little nervous about that. All right, so the debt. All right, the war cost Britain about, what was that, like 70 million pounds, and that will also inflate the country's national debt. So how are they going to pay for this? Taxes. The first tax will be the sugar tax. This is in 1764. And I'm not going to go over all the details on it, but the key thing here is to remember that if you're caught violating this, you were tried in an admiralty court. And the big thing here is there's no trial by jury, and that was always considered a British right. Then you have the Stamp Act, quickly to follow, in 1765. And as you see in that cartoon there, probably a pretty famous political cartoon, that the Stamp Act is not very well received, and we'll talk about that in our next video. But the threats thereon of anybody who's going to sell this stamp will be very effective, and so will the boycott of anything made in Britain. You also have the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act is going to try to alleviate the stress on the British government of housing and feeding all of the troops that are stationed there, and so the colonists were expected to help with this. Not necessarily house them in your own homes, but to provide housing and food for these men. The colonists are not really pleased with that. All right, repeal, tax, and repeat. It's a common theme we're going to see here for a couple of years up until the Revolution. So again, we'll talk more about this in the other video, but remember, because of the Stamp Act, there are many boycotts that will take place, and these are going to be very successful, not just because you're getting death threats, but because financially you're hitting Britain where it hurts the most. And so Parliament is going to agree to repeal the Stamp Act. So not a single stamp was ever sold. But they do also pass the Declaratory Act, basically to say although we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, we still have the right to tax you. So I don't know how many colonists really heard that. I think they were just excited that the Stamp Act was no more, and so they were happy with Parliament, happy with the king, and things looked okay. But then we get the Townshend Acts, 1767, that will tax the kind of the basic supplies of life here: the glass, also lead, paper, and tea. Again, the boycotts kick in. Most of these acts are going to be repealed, except for the tea tax, which again is just trying to signal to the colonies, we can still tax you if we want to. So to tax or not to tax, that is the question. So you have the Tea Act in 1773. Parliament is going to lower the tax that the East India Company pays to sell the tea to Britain, thereby giving the company a monopoly in the colonies and making the tea cheaper in the colonies. So you're basically eliminating the middleman, which is going to make the tea cheaper, and of course the Parliament just assumed that the colonists would be really happy about this tax break, and everyone drinks tea, so this is going to make life a lot easier and no one's going to hate each other. But of course we had a little party over that because colonists are not going to be real happy with the Tea Act, and that leads to the coercive acts, or as we call them, the intolerable acts, aimed at Massachusetts and of course Boston. But the other colonies pretty quickly figure out that if you can do this to one colony, you can do this to all of the others. So then we're jumping here to what's going to happen on the Lexington and Concord. And basically the whole time you should be thinking of how are these British actions, how are they being perceived, how are they being interpreted by some of the colonists. Not all of the colonists, but some of them. The British General Gage, he will be ordered to round up Sam Adams and also John Hancock, two of the major leaders of this revolutionary movement, parts of the Sons of Liberty, both very popular, but also very popular in terms of their writing. So they are getting the word out very effectively about what's happening in Massachusetts and Boston. And so that's why the British realize if we can get these two guys, maybe we can kind of put a lid on things. He's also told to confiscate weapons and ammunition that the colonists were storing in Concord. So remember here is that if you were British, you felt you had the right to basically defend yourselves. So by having the regulars, the British soldiers come in and take your weapons, take your ammunition, you're not only leading these men and women to be the defenseless against the British, but also defenseless in an area where you still need to defend yourself against really the wilderness and especially Native Americans. So they are particularly taken back by the fact that not only are you taxing us unfairly, but it seems to be that you're also denying us some of our basic rights. So of course we know the story. Again, I'll go into more detail on the next video, but what you see here is after these two skirmishes, you've got regulars that are going to be surprised by the colonial militia, and that there'll be two battles, one at Concord and one at Lexington, that will leave 73 regulars killed and 49 colonists dead. So really the message is that the British are willing to attack their own people, and the colonists are willing to defend their home. And how is this going to lead us down the road? Can we come back from actually having this amount of bloodshed? Can we find peace?